The Resident Evil 2 remake had its problems, with the biggest one being the 4 campaigns being too similar to each other, even more so than the original game. But for the most part, it was fantastic, so I was greatly looking forward to the direct follow-up, despite concerns that it's only been a year later, and even though the demo didn't quite feel right, I was still on board to see what the full game had to offer. Well, disappointment isn't quite a strong enough word. This entry made such drastic changes coming right off the heels of the previous game, and some of it is straight up antithetical to Resident Evil as a franchise. It comes off as either misguided or due to severe budget constraints, or both most likely. It's still an alright game for what it is, but man, Capcom really dropped the ball here. Resident Evil 3 starts off the day before Resident Evil 2 takes place, with Jill Valentine getting a wake-up call by a new, powerful monster known as Nemesis, deployed by Umbrella to eliminate the surviving members of STARS, in order to help bury the truth from the first Resident Evil game. Upon escaping from her apartment, Jill finds the city completely out of control, giving the rather absurd impression that all of this seems to have occurred overnight. Jill soon runs into Carlos Oliveira, a mercenary part of Umbrella's cleanup crew to rid the city of its zombies.
I promise you're in good hands. I'm with the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, UBCS for short.
Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? You guys are the ones who caused all of this!
Whoa, 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 whoa. What are you talking about? Look, you don't have to trust me, but I'm going to the shelter. You coming?
And the two partner up to get a subway car full of survivors out of the city.
My platoon has suffered serious losses. Just keeping them alive is more than I can manage.
Well, you can thank your corporate overlords for that.
Yes. Well, we are doing all we can. If we can get this subway train moving, we can evacuate some survivors.
All the while, Nemesis continues to block their every turn. Much like Resident Evil 2 Remake, the story of the original game is expanded upon and more fleshed out. Every character gets a lot more screen time, even Mikhail, who didn't really do much before.
Oh, this looks bad.
Around the game's second half, even the more easily forgettable characters like Tyrell and the hospital Dr. Nathaniel are given much more prominent roles. There's a greater emphasis on the story, and Resident Evil 3 Remake handles it pretty well. Far more so than the PS1 original, which didn't have that much of a story in the first place. On top of that, the RE engine is shown off in full glory once again. Just like the 3 games before it, it looks beautiful, especially in the dedicated cutscenes. And the general animations, like zombies stumbling around, continue to look excellent. I still think Devil May Cry 5 is the best use of this engine, and I think Resident Evil 2 Remake also looked better than this one overall. But regardless, this remake is still a treat for the eyes. As great as the presentation is, the gameplay is where things start to fall apart. For the most part, it plays very similar to the Resident Evil 2 remake. Stand still to focus your aim, land clean shots, etc, etc. On the surface, we've seen this all before, but there are some new design principles that alter the game pretty significantly. Perhaps most of all is its linearity. Now, out of the original trilogy of Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 3 was no doubt the most linear. However, the downtown and uptown maps of the Raccoon City streets was still pretty large and open-ended. Opening the gate to City Hall, getting the fire hose, and repairing the tram car made up a pretty significant portion of the game's time, and a fair bit of it included plenty of backtracking. The remake opens up in a similar fashion, with a city streets area being the first proper level of the game, but once you find that fire hose and put out the fire early on, then it becomes a very linear ride where the player is basically on rails for the rest of the game. I do like what they did with the hospital this time around, but this new sewers area is a poor replacement for the Raccoon City Park and the Clock Tower. And while I hate to get into spoilers, it bears mentioning. The Dead Factory from the original game is replaced with an underground lab that not only reuses some assets from Resident Evil 2 Remake, but even has the nerve to call the place Nest 2. Come on, man. The substation early on and this warehouse later in the game are pretty great since the layout is interesting and you actually have to use the map to navigate, but at least half of the game is just pushing forward from one set piece to the next. I would have been okay with this if it was just for the game's opening sequence, but they do this sort of thing kind of often, where you just run down a basic path with nothing in your way. It's really odd and not what I typically think about when Resident Evil comes to mind. I also find the big new inclusion here, the dodge mechanic, to be far too difficult to properly use.
Come on, you creepy ass stalker! You want stars? Ah!
And this especially hurts because I'm sure the awesome defensive weapons were removed for its inclusion. The dodge mechanic's precise timing was a similar case with the original PS1 game as well, but it worked well enough as a last-second desperation move, except against Nemesis where it's required to master it. But Nemesis attacks were also very heavily telegraphed, so it wasn't that bad. With the remake, the game sets up enemies in such a way that you basically have to dodge in order to get past unscathed. Zombies move a little too quickly, are way too sturdy, and they take a massive chunk of your health on hardcore difficulty. It's not like situations like this never happened in the previous remake, but zombies in that game were placed in really smart ways. It was rare to find larger groups of them, and when you did, there was usually plenty of room to stun them and run past, or at least kite them around a large table. If nothing else, you at least had the defensive weapons as a last resort. With Resident Evil 3 Remake, you're not afforded such liberties. Instead, your best bet is to rely on explosive barrels and electric generators. Similar to the original game, but it's not always enough. It comes across as if the difficulty of Resident Evil 2 Remake was carried over, but now with double the zombies and more aggressive enemies. Only they didn't think about how this might disrupt the balance. I'm sure the player can consistently get really good at dodging enemy attacks, but I don't believe that's the strength of Resident Evil games. It reminds me a lot of The Evil Within, a horror game that's slower paced but still action heavy. Thankfully, this Crosshair isn't anywhere near as bad, but you can't introduce a larger enemy count without considering the other aspects. The only games to my recollection that did this right were Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space, and they did it by having extremely accurate shots, slow and easily stunned enemies, and in the case of Resident Evil 4, easy access to free crowd control options. Resident Evil 2 Remake took away a lot of that, but also greatly limited the enemy numbers and what they're capable of, and it did a good job at balancing everything out. Resident Evil 3 Remake then took that, ballooned the enemy numbers without properly compensating for the player, made some cute little set pieces, and didn't do a whole lot else. You still have a really slow fire rate and the player taking massive damage on the hardcore difficulty. So even if the game does furnish you with plenty of supplies, and like any typical Resident Evil game, it sure does, that doesn't change the fact that combat is typically slow, it's harder than ever to run past enemies, and the game is encouraging the player to partake in combat when that's not the strength here. This shouldn't be what these kind of Resident Evil games should focus on. But if only it was simply left at that, then I could say they just didn't pull it off so well. But no, there's more. Here's where things get really bad. Check this out. I honestly couldn't even believe it myself, but yeah, the AI has a tether here that pulls them back to where they're supposed to go. Once enemies cross an invisible line, they immediately turn around and walk away. I know this is a typical video game thing, it's not necessarily uncommon, but this is coming directly off of Resident Evil 2 Remake. That game did a phenomenal job at having zombies follow the player from room to room, and here they just turn around and walk away. I'm so baffled. How did it come to this? This isn't to say that zombies will never follow you through multiple areas, but it just almost never happens. The same goes for Nemesis too. He'll chase you around for a bit, but the second you enter an area that disallows him from continuing, that's it. I mean, if they're doing a cute little cutscene where they blow Nemesis up with Claymore, then yeah, that's fine, I'll concede. But the game will just randomly decide like, no, Nemesis won't be going through that door. See, Jill just got on the radio, you have to wait for her to finish. What is this? I get that the way Nemesis would quote-unquote follow you around in the PS1 original game was more smoke and mirrors than anything else, but 20 years later and we're doing this nonsense? In fact, the only part of the game where Nemesis actually acts like Nemesis is in that opening streets area, which is about the first quarter of the game. After that, he purely becomes a set-piece enemy and little else. They don't even attempt to do something with him in the sewers. Forget about the clock tower. At least you can fight him if you want to, and you're rewarded with weapon upgrades for taking him down. But fighting Nemesis in this game is really dumb and goofy. You're oftentimes right up in his face, which makes the slow-mo effect after a dodge come off as really silly. And God forbid you mess up. 2 hits and you're dead. Look at this, I fully heal myself here, barely make it to the door, Nemesis throws one last cheap shot at me, and I'm back to being 1 shot away from death. It's so unforgiving, it's ridiculous. Not even the original PS1 game was this bad on the hard difficulty. Now, to be fair, if you play on the standard difficulty, then the game is enjoyable for the most part. But Resident Evil games typically get their longevity from multiple difficulties and achieving higher end-of-game rankings. And while you are given plenty of supplies to deal with the hardcore difficulty, it still feels really wrong and obnoxious to spend so much ammo and have your health deplete so drastically from a sideways glance. Again, look at this. Full health, hit through the door by Nemesis, stumble in front of a zombie, dead. Absolutely ridiculous. I'm sorry, I can't defend this. And there are still 2 more difficulties above hardcore. Well, guess what? I already got an S rank on the hardest difficulty. This is because the player is given points for achieving certain milestones to buy special items. Not unusual, most of the Resident Evil games did something similar, but this is one of the few that doesn't punish the player for doing so. If nothing else, this gives me the proof I need that they didn't even bother to balance this game in the slightest. If the player is finding it too difficult, just give them the infinite ammo assault rifle and get your S rank for free. And I don't care to hear about so-and-so's YouTube video where they beat Inferno difficulty using only the knife and still got an S rank. Good for them, I'm sure it was extremely challenging and they should be proud of their achievement. Doesn't change the fact that the designers completely screwed up the difficulty balancing. While hardcore difficulty was challenging but reasonable in the original game, it's downright sadistic in this one. Okay, I'm gonna give credit where credit is due on a few little points. On the higher difficulties, enemy and item locations are different. That's pretty cool, and I'm even gonna go ahead and ignore the fact that on the 2 higher difficulties, zombies just straight up fall from the sky. Because sure, why not? The Hunter Gamma enemies have a pretty cool design. The boss fights are also way better than in the previous remake, because it's more than just hit and run tactics. There's a little more to it, even though it can be a little gimmicky at times. And while the final boss is insanely overpowered, I at least like it conceptually. So there's that, at least. And again, a single playthrough on the standard difficulty isn't so bad. But by the same token, there's nothing really special here. This was all done way better in the previous remake, and they butchered about half there was from the PS1 original. Most of the maps in this game don't even feel like proper Resident Evil maps. Even the Resident Evil 2 remake sewers are way better than this. It comes off more like a series of Fort Survivor games, or perhaps more like the way more difficult Ghost Survivors. They're all just really linear and you have to figure out what you need to do through trial and error. Even if you're a huge fan of Resident Evil 2 Remake, I'd put this one off until it's on sale for a pretty steep discount. This one's okay for like 1 playthrough and that's about it. The higher difficulties are worthless since they're clearly designed around using special items to complete them. And using the infinite ammo assault rifle makes even the highest difficulty a complete joke. You could buy the lockpick and the bolt cutters to have access to them at the start of the game, which does offer some slight sequence breaking, as well as unlocking some secrets in the hospital. but it doesn't really amount to much at all. I went into this game blind on day one, did the best I could to force myself through the hardcore difficulty, and I did not enjoy myself as much as I wanted to. It's still a passable game, it's still above average, but it's not great. Thanks for watching my review on Resident Evil 3 Remake. For the next video, I'll be covering the multiplayer portion, Resident Evil Resistance. And if you'd like to hear further thoughts, my good friend at the YouTube channel One Doom Game Critic was gracious enough to host me in a 3.5-hour podcast on it. I'll put the link to that in the description below. And once again, thanks for watching.